had to stop that before the bad words came on. Hey, Crim... Who are you? Crim 4. Crim 4, Chapter 13. Sentencing and Appeals. Here we go. History of punishment. Okay, so a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, people really weren't punished by being locked up. Many years ago, people were typically fined, beaten, or put to death. That was pretty much it. So that's what punishment used to be. Now, probably the last maybe 100 years or so, we've been locking people up as a form of punishment. So typically what's supposed to happen, the more serious the crime, the more severe the punishment. Kind of makes sense. So what are some reasons or sentencing philosophies, reasons for sentencing? Retribution. That is the concept of an eye for an eye. Revenge, vengeance. That's retribution, kind of getting even with someone. Incapacitation. This means a person is locked up so they literally cannot commit a crime because they are in a jail or prison cell. I'm going to skip deterrence and I'm going to come back to it, okay? We're going to go to rehabilitation. I think you all know what rehabilitation is. You're fixing a problem. There's something wrong and you're going to fix it. Just imagine, you had knee surgery and you go through rehabilitation, to get that knee back to where it's supposed to be. Okay, deterrence. I'm going to talk about two different types, specific and general. And this is my easiest way to describe the concept, is to tell you a story. It is not a true story, so bear with me. I'm just making it up. Wink, wink. Okay, so my husband and I went to a party, and it was at a friend's house. This was before social distancing and being quarantined, by the way, because we wouldn't want to do anything against the rules. So I had 8 shots of Fireball in 1 hour. And I was walking back to the car, and I had my keys in my hand, and I'm like, hey, it's time to go. And I'm stumbling around, whatever, and I get to the car door, and I think, oh my gosh, remember that time I got a DUI? Remember how embarrassing it was? I had to go to jail. Remember how much money it costs because I had to pay legal fees and all that kind of stuff? Remember how embarrassing it was I had to Uber everywhere because I didn't have a driver's license? Remember how disappointed my family was in me? Man, I am not going to drink and drive today because I remember what happened to me last time. And that was enough deterrence for me to keep me from doing that. Okay? That's specific deterrence. I was deterred from doing something by something that had previously happened to me. Okay? Now we're moving on to general deterrence. Same story. My husband and I go out to a party. I have 8 shots of Fireball. I'm stumbling out of the house. I got the keys to the car in my hand, getting ready to drive, and I stop and think, oh my gosh. Remember when my husband got that DUI? Remember how embarrassing it was? Remember how much money it costs and how sucky his life was during that time? Remember how embarrassed the family was and how I'm not going to do it because I saw what happened to him. General deterrence. Okay, makes sense. Specific, it happened to me. General, I saw it happen to someone else. How long, this is a good question. How long should an offender be isolated for society's protection? A lot of us would say until they're no longer a danger. How do we know that? How do we know what's in someone's heart? Pretty hard to say. Other penalties. Oh yeah, punishment means any unpleasantness, I love that word, that the convicted person may suffer. Restrictions, whether imprisonment, suspended sentence, probation, these are all supposed to be forms of unpleasantness, in addition to things like community service and fines. Talked about that already. Misdemeanor sentencing. Typically, if you have been convicted of a misdemeanor, you could go to jail for up to 1 year, and you could be fined up to $1,000. Now, we all know in California right now, if you've committed a misdemeanor, the likelihood of you doing even 1 day behind bars is really slim, but technically you could. Felony sentencing. This is someone that can be imprisoned for more than a year, and their fines could be significant. But typically, when you think of a felony, this is a person whose maximum period of confinement is more than a year. They could go to prison, they could go to jail, they could do probation, all that kind of stuff. I mentioned this in the last lecture, pre-sentence investigation reports. This is a report that is prepared by a probation officer. Typically a very lengthy, in-depth report that talks about the offender. Everything about the offender, from their family, to their work history, to their education, to their military service, their drug use, who they associate with, whether they're employed, all that kind of stuff. And they talk about the offense. At the end of that report is basically designed to give the court as much information as it possibly can, so the court has all this information when making a decision for sentencing purposes. The only time a jury would impose a sentence is in a death penalty case. Oh, indeterminate. Okay, I'm skipping. Sorry there. Indeterminate sentences. The length of a sentence has yet to be pronounced. So let me kind of explain indeterminate sentencing. I'm going to give you an example of an indeterminate sentence, and I'll give you an example of a person specifically, my friend Brian the murderer. Brian was convicted of second-degree murder, and he had a firearms enhancement, which was an additional 2 years. So his conviction was 15 years to life, plus 2 years for using a firearm. So ultimately, at the end of the day, his sentence was 17 years to life. That is an indeterminate sentence because we don't know when the absolute end date is. There's a range of dates. We know he's going to be in custody for at least 17 years, and he might be in custody for the rest of his life. But we're not really sure. That hasn't been determined yet, so it's an indeterminate sentence. Now, Brian ultimately was able to parole out, so he did about 22 years. But we didn't know that it was an indeterminate sentence. His release was based on his behavior, and he did really well in custody, so he was able to get released on that indeterminate sentence. Okay, determinate sentence is a set sentence. This is an example here, VC 10851 sub A. This is a felony vehicle theft. The absolute longest a person could be in custody for a felony vehicle theft is 3 years. That is determined. That is a determinate sentence. Now, they might get out earlier than that, but we know when the end date is, for sure. So that's the difference between the two. 15 to life versus 3-year max. I hope that makes sense. This is like the worst question. Well, not one of the worst. One of the worst questions. I think we talked about a lot of stuff in this class that everything is so vague. But how do you know that an offender is rehabilitated? Again, Brian the murderer. How does the parole board know that he's not going to go out and kill somebody again? Right. I mean, I don't know that any more than you do. He hasn't. He's off parole now, and he's done fabulous. How do you know? Really hard. It's really hard. So there are advantages and disadvantages of indeterminate sentences. As you can imagine, basically the parole board is getting to decide when these people get out. These people who have indeterminate sentences. What if you have a racist on the parole board? And you have a black man trying to get out of custody, and he can't because that parole board person, I'm sure there's a better term for it than that, but whatever, you know what I'm talking about. That member of the parole board doesn't like black people, so he's not going to let them out. So obviously, that can be a problem. It really can. Escaping that. A lot of people would argue that, again, going back to Brian the murderer, after he'd served 21 years in custody, who would be better equipped to decide whether or not he should get released? The judge who sentenced him 21 years earlier, or the parole board who works for the facility where he's been housed for the last 21 years? Well, it would make sense that the parole board probably has a better idea at that point of what his behavior is like. Probation is a suspended sentence. Ultimately, the judge is saying, I'm going to give you a chance to live in the community under these certain rules. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, I'm going to lock you up. Makes sense? Yeah, and it was my job as a probation officer to make sure that they were following the rules that the court put in place. Oh, this is my dude, John Augustus. So John Augustus was from a fairly wealthy family in the Boston area. And John Augustus, they owned a cobbler business. They made shoes. And for whatever reason, John Augustus was interested in the court system. So in his free time, he would go sit in the courthouse and listen to the cases that were being heard in court. And after he sat there for a while, he realized that a lot of the people being sentenced, a lot of the prisoners, had the same problem. A lot of them were alcoholics that couldn't manage their money well. So they had trouble staying sober, and they had trouble paying all their fines so that they could get out of custody. So he asked the judge one day, "Hey, judge, will you let this guy come home with me? And I will teach him a trade," meaning teach him how to be a cobbler, build shoes, make shoes. "I'll get him sober, and I'll bring him back to you, a new man." And the judge said, "What the heck? Knock yourself out, John Augustus." So he did. And that was the beginning. That was the first early form of probation. And little by little, and John volunteered to do it, and a lot of other people, wealthier people from the community, started doing the same. And ultimately, after decades and decades, it became a career. And obviously, nowadays, we probation officers, we did not take our clients home. But anyways, that's how it all started. Conditions of probation are there are certain things that you can and cannot do while you're on probation. If you're an alcoholic, then you shouldn't drink alcohol. The judge is probably going to order that. If you're a child molester, you probably shouldn't be around schools. The judge is going to order that. If you don't follow those terms and conditions that the judge orders, your probation will be revoked. That's what we're talking about here, revocation of probation. You're taking something back. I'm taking your probation back, and I'm going to lock you up. There are criticisms of probation. Why do we have probation? Because we can't lock everybody up. Why do we use it so much? Because prisons are so overcrowded. Is it effective? I don't know. Good question, right? And the death penalty, let's talk about, oh no, I'm sorry, I just did another lecture for another class. Eighth Amendment. There was a time in the United States where the courts were considering whether or not the death penalty would be considered cruel and unusual punishment. In the early 1970s, there was a short moratorium on the death penalty cases throughout the United States. And that would be the time when Charles Manson committed his murders. That lasted a year or so, but the courts ultimately did decide that the death penalty is not cruel and unusual punishment. And so it is still legal in the United States. Not every state allows for it. As you know, in California right now, we have a moratorium on the death penalty. And that is as long as Governor Newsom is in office. Maybe after that too, who knows? But at this point, it's just until then. Alternate sentencing procedure. Aggravating versus mitigating circumstances. I'm going to tell you two stories of a vehicle theft case. And one of them is going to be aggravating, one of them is going to be mitigating. Okay, I left my car keys on the kitchen counter, and my son took my car joyriding and brought it back in one piece. That's a vehicle theft. He took that car without my permission, right? So I would say that that's not the most serious vehicle theft case I've ever heard. Here's another case. My son goes to my neighbor's front yard, smashes in his car window, steals his car, drives it, goes joyriding, drives it through some vineyards, smashes all the windows out, and he poops on the driver's seat as he leaves the car. Kind of an aggravated offense, right? It's a little more aggressive than the other one. So sentencing can be based on how serious that particular offense was. Okay? Aggravating circumstances, things that made that crime really bad, or mitigating circumstances, things that made the crime not as bad. Again, going back to, a woman goes to Walmart to steal baby formula because her baby is starving, versus a woman goes to Walmart to steal baby formula because her drug dealer wants to buy an assault rifle. Right? Mitigating, aggravating. There's different versions. Okay. So, in order to be put to death, you have to have been convicted of murder. Period. Someone must die. If you are mentally retarded, you cannot be put to death. That is your book's language, not mine. Appeal. If you do not like the ruling, or if you think that something illegal or unfair happened during the trial, you can appeal and have a higher court look at it to see if there were any errors or mistakes. Okay, makes sense? You just go to a higher court. If the appellate court doesn't give you what you want, then you go to the Supreme Court. Prosecution does not typically get a chance for appeals. I'm skipping that, blah, blah, blah. Yes, judges in appellate courts are called justices. Number of justices different from state to state, blah, blah, blah. In most states, the judge determines the sentence. Pre-sentence investigations are done. Probation is the most popular form of punishment, and appeals are allowed. That's it. We made it.